and speak to some of the investors operating in this space. So perhaps if we could start by you guys each introducing yourselves and your background.
Sure. John Danner. I'm a San Francisco-based investor. I invest in consumer education, so things where you're not selling to schools. A couple of my investments are Lambda School, which is online computer science, and Hello School, which is a live marketplace of teachers teaching classes mostly to homeschoolers. And I also have several other investments in vocational and early childhood.
Hey, my name is Jan. I run a company called Emerge Education. We're a London-based VC focused on education and learning businesses at the seed stage. We've backed companies like Aula, PyTalk, EdTech, and Rody waving in the back. A few of the businesses on the panel as well. I guess we are different from other VCs in that we focus not just on the capital, but also on building a powerful network of decision makers in the education industry, predominantly in the UK, and helping our companies get access to customers that way.
Hi, now I know why Ben took the early train back to Paris, because we had a nice firing squad set up for us with the previous panel. But I'm Alex Spiro. I'm from Managing Partner at Bright Ventures. We are the largest tech-focused fund in Europe, and we look at Series A stage companies principally, but also look at late seed. And really, we have a very broad thesis around investing in education. So we invest in direct-to-consumer companies. We also invest in companies that devise products and services for existing educational institutions. So really, our thesis is around the fact that many of the trends we saw developing in the US with digital penetration in schools and universities and institutions, replicating in Europe, but also alongside that willingness to pay from consumers and at all levels was also increasing in Europe as the skills gap widens. So that's really where we're coming at things from.
Hi, my name is Owen. I'm investment director at Pearson Ventures. Previously at Pearson Affordable Learning Fund, which was an impact-driven CVC at Pearson, obviously. That was a $25 million fund that's not closed, and so I still spent half my time with that, but we recently launched in April to envision as a 3-year, $50 million fund in terms of funds going out the door. We don't have a specific timeline to bring money back. We do Series A and B investments. We haven't made any investments yet, but we're chatting to a few folks and are likely to make a few investments this year. We have kind of 7 geographies and a few kind of sector preferences, but I can leave that for later. I think that the last bit that we're just trying to figure out is kind of, we want to operate in some ways like a VC, kind of not ask for maybe some of the owner's terms or non-competes that a corporate investor would usually angle for, but maybe try to leverage some of our values being the world's largest global education company, because we think hopefully that could bring value to the startups that we'll invest in.
Great, thank you. So kicking off first question, I guess we want to understand why you're interested in the EdTech space and why you chose to invest in this space over any other.
Sure. I guess the company's history is so everyone on our team has had some sort of inflection point in our lives where largely because of education we sort of ended up doing stuff that we shouldn't really be doing. I'm from an immigrant family in Germany that came from the Soviet Union in the late 70s and started from zero, and through my educational experience, a lot of luck and privilege, ended up doing something that I'm really passionate about. But I guess we're based on the realization that a lot of these inflection points happened more because of circumstance than because of merit, essentially. And the reason we exist is to invest in companies that level the playing field and make that not the norm.
I mean, from our perspective, we see a huge opportunity investing in education. it's acyclical and counter-cyclical in many respects. So when the rest of the economy is doing badly or poorly, people tend to go back to studying. So it's a very resilient sector. It's a very large sector. We all know the stats here in this room. I'm not going to repeat them. I was saying, earlier, lots of VCs chase sectors like entertainment and media and have great stories around investing in those sectors. It's about sort of a third of the size of our sector. So I always say, why not invest in EdTech? And the answer I often get is, oh, well, where are the exits? And it's so difficult to scale EdTech businesses. And what I always say is, it depends on your definition of EdTech, right? It depends on your definition of investing and learning. There are so many different ways you can learn and train yourself. There are so many different constituents and clients for these businesses. So as long as you broaden your horizons of what investing and learning is, then I think it's an absolutely huge opportunity.
Well, for us, probably at the high level, the answer is pretty obvious. We're an education company. But I think that the point about being acyclical is absolutely true. And kind of as an area also, I would say that it's in most areas, if you pick it right, it's demographic driven. So, like as the population grows or as people have different skilling needs, that kind of underlying pressure is going to, I think, put a lot of money and interest in the market at a high level. I'd say that,
I'd say for me, it's really quite personal. So my first company I started was a company called Net Gravity, an internet advertising company that we took public and sold to a company called DoubleClick. And I retired and I was young and I kind of thought, well, what do you actually want to do with your life? And I didn't think internet advertising and commerce was a very good life goal. So I kind of switched completely. I helped a friend start a school, middle school, and then became a public school teacher for 3 years, and then ended up starting a network of schools called Rocket Ship Education in the U.S. that's blended, some of the first blended schools. And I would say, after a series of companies, the reason that I decided to start writing checks into education is I think education, like healthcare, is one of those areas where the system's not really going to change itself. There's a tremendous amount of inertia and a lot of biases towards the status quo among parents, students, the system. And so I think it's a real place where the private markets can cause change to happen that people may not appreciate in the short term, may even be against, but kind of as a necessary way to try to move things forward.
Some of our earlier panelists discussed some of the challenges that they have identified operating in Europe. So I guess we wanted to know, are you optimistic about investing in Europe? Do you see opportunities elsewhere, or do you think that there are opportunities that we can maximise in the EdTech space in Europe?
There are absolutely opportunities you can maximise on in Europe. I think, I'll give you an example of, again, coming back to sort of broadening the definition of what learning and training is, but a company in which we invested in Paris, just focused on the French market, has built a very, very large business in a very short space of time around driver's education. Doesn't sound like the sexiest thing, but obviously when you consider that young French people, about 1 million of them on a yearly basis, get a driving license, and they have to go down to a driving school in order to get the study materials, in order to get in touch with an instructor. Making that process fluid and efficient, leveraging technology, there are going to be lots of buyers for that. It's a huge group of people who were spending €2,500 on average for this service and are able to now spend closer to 750 euros. So that's an example of one European market where a very large business has been built in a very short space of time, and that we see as EdTech. So it really just depends on business. It depends on, and there are others that are more back-end services. There's a company, that Jan has always shepherded, which is great, called One, which does sort of data management for schools. That's the type of service you can scale really everywhere in Europe, right? So it just depends on the type of business. I think it's really particular to that.
Yeah, I'd say if your definition of success is a unicorn B2C business, then maybe not. But actually, a lot of the most interesting businesses in the education space, in my opinion, aren't doing that. There's a lot of really interesting B2B plays. A lot of them aren't focused on the K-12 market, and then sometimes the exits might look differently. Kind of going back to education is a multi-year process usually if you think about it traditionally. So you have a lot of transparency in the future cash flows if you get it right. You kind of know your customers, you take care of them, they're going to come back to you in multiple times. It's not a one-time transaction, and so that can be like a really attractive kind of business to be in. But it's not going to list in 5 years with an eye-watering valuation. So I think it also depends on kind of aligning your expectations, and then also just like kind of not always only thinking about the most top-of-mind definition of education. If you're like, oh, it's a new cool book for children, and you're like, maybe that's not going to blow up. But there's like so many other needs in the space to be explored.
I would add maybe a slightly more controversial perspective, somewhat disagreeing with some of what you guys have said. Looking at our portfolio, the most successful companies in that group get the majority of their revenue either in Asia or in the US. And if you look at the US as an example, that's 1/3 of the world's education spend. So none of that is like logically inconsistent with what you've said, but I think it's also a reality that needs to be pointed out. And certainly, we're really passionate about investing in companies that start in Europe and that have fantastic founders in Europe, but who are addressing global opportunities and who think global from day one, as I'm sure you are. I would also add just an interesting perspective, which I think makes Europe so interesting for investors, which is that we've done some mapping of the market, and we have considerable confidence that about 25% of global EdTech formations are in Europe, so companies being founded. But depending on who you listen to, between 1 and 8% of global EdTech investment goes to those 25% of EdTech companies. So I just do not believe, like any day, that is efficient allocation of capital, and I think there's a massive opportunity to find exceptional founders in Europe that are just underfunded because the major investors are looking at other markets where there's the perceived greater opportunity, funding them early and then helping them scale.
So I'm the American, and you might ask, well, what are you doing here? I think the reason I like Europe, so I have 2 investments here, Lingo Kids, which is early childhood English learning, and Kunduz, which is a test prep company started in Turkey and now working in India as well. I think what Jan said about global is really important. I think that because you don't have a US or China-sized market, a lot of companies kind of think global early, and I think in certain sectors that's really the right way to go. Language learning, test prep, things like that, you can do that well. There are obviously places where that doesn't work well at all, but in areas where you can have a global subscription app, for example, I think it's very, very powerful. I also think, frankly, it's not a good thing to hear as a founder, but the lack of capital, especially in this area, is a massive advantage to those of us coming from Silicon Valley and elsewhere, because I was at the conference yesterday, and there were at least half a dozen companies that I guarantee you, if they were based in Silicon Valley, would have had checks written to them already, and it's just much harder here. And so, as an investor, I'm always amazed at kind of the quality of the companies relative to the amount that they've raised.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I don't think that any of us on this panel disagree that looking at large markets in Asia or looking at the US should be an objective for the companies in which we invest in Europe. And I think often that's something that we require them to have in their sights in order to make an investment case. But the challenge that you have in Europe is that they have to really have a differentiated product or service, because as you rightly said, it's a lot easier to raise capital in the US. There's a lot more capital on offer. There are 20-odd funds focused on investing in education technology in the US, whereas there are 2, 3, whichever way you see it in Europe. And so there's a lot more competition to get the funding from European companies, so it forces them to be better or sort of more efficient. But equally, they have to be, because there are companies that are perhaps worse in the US that have received $10 or $15 million of funding. So I think that's what we look at. It's always how do you differentiate yourself, because when you go to the US, it's a highly competitive market. You need to be prepared to get back to it initially. It's not an easy thing to do, right?
So I think you've all sort of identified that a global outlook is important in any of the startups that you want to invest in. But can I get a show of hands? I think we did this before, of how many of the startup companies here are looking for investment? So I guess my question for the panel is, what would be the ideal sell for you? What would you hear from these startup investors coming to speak to you that makes you think, yes, I want to invest in this company?
It's a massive opportunity that no one's seen yet. The market's actually perceived to be really small, but it's growing really quickly, and we can believe that is happening. And all the other VCs think this is totally crazy, and I don't want to touch it. And on the flip side, we happen to think that we can add massive value through our network, and we believe in the opportunity. I think that's sort of the ideal scenario that every VC wants to see, and which rarely happens. The reality is that most great deals are very competitive, and you kind of know it when you see it. Just before, I would add one other thing, which is something that's really personally important to me and the team at Emerge, is that we want to back founders who are as dedicated to sort of our mission of eradicating sort of the role of circumstance in people fulfilling their potential. And we believe it's really important that they're aligned to that vision, because the ups and downs of the entrepreneurial journey will inevitably lead them to a point where they hit a wall, and the only way to climb over that wall is to sort of have that inhumane vision driving you, and no sort of mercenary focus on money is going to get you over the wall. And we've seen that so many times in our portfolio.
Yeah, I just start really high level. Obviously we have our more narrow investment criteria, which I'm not really sure one-on-one, but I think that, at least personally, the first is like a nuanced business model. Like you've actually thought through, you're going to sell this to and actually understand how this subsector works. You'd be surprised a lot of times. It's kind of like, I'm gonna sell to schools. It gets a lot more complicated. Who's procurement officer and stuff like that. So kind of a nuanced business model. The second one is probably, at least in education, this is something like for more patient investors. Like I said, we don't have a fund life, so we can kind of take the view of like what's good for growing the business rather than having to get back to our LPs in 5 years. So that gives us some flexibility, but not sometimes actually trying to like take over the world, so to speak, can be a pretty bad thing, because it can lead you to really irresponsible decisions, both kind of unethical but also on a business standpoint. So maybe having thought through like, no, I don't need to grow this too quickly into a $500 million company, because sometimes it's a great $100 million company, it's a great $50 million company. As soon as you start trying to claim it's something bigger, it seems pretty uncredible. It's like pretty hard to defend, and then you kind of lose credibility. And I guess the last one, this is more personal, but I have an education background myself, and at Pearson we take efficacy pretty seriously. And so having someone on the leadership team, maybe not the founding, the leadership team, who has experience in education is a huge plus. I think a lot of times I'll talk to folks who, it's just a rock star team who come in, but they're from a totally different sector, and they just have these massive blind spots that you're like, nope, like that's going to be a huge pitfall in 6 months from now. But it's just very tough for them to grasp, because there's no one in that leadership team who has that voice at the table.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna, I think what both of these guys have said so far is absolutely right, and I concur. Especially on the efficacy side, another thing that we look at is, do you have any proof of the efficacy, really? I mean, studies, real studies, because people can claim that they're improving outcomes, but, it's just a claim. It's a good marketing tool, but if you have proof of efficacy, that's extremely valuable. The other thing for us, honestly, because maybe perhaps unlike other people on the panel, we do operate more as a traditional VC would, in the sense that we do have to, we do have LPs that we have to make returns for. We are looking for education businesses that can scale globally and that have a route to 100 million annual run rate. I mean, the period of time in which they can get to that, obviously, where more patient capital than a traditional journalist VC would be. But we are looking for very large opportunities, and that forces us to have quite a broad definition of education and training. But yeah, otherwise, I completely agree with the businesses as well.
So I guess I would say one of the challenges both with starting companies in education and investing in them is a very large percentage of the ideas are incremental ideas. So I would say that 90% of the things I see are like, I'm going to make this professor at college better at what they do or something like that, which is awesome. Like, you should do that. But it's extremely unlikely that changes the course of education. Like, it's just not, that's not how it works. You want to, for me, what I want to see is very non-conformist founders doing things that probably aren't going to work, but if they did, it would be cool. That's why my firm's called Dunce Capital. We're almost always wrong, right? That's actually, I think, the way you want to think as an entrepreneur is very likely what I'm doing is going to fail, but wouldn't it be amazing if it worked? And I think that's really what's interesting to me, because I don't think education is going to move to a great place incrementally. I think it's really going to have to go through some pretty dramatic, chaotic changes to get to a place where every kid gets a great education, regardless of where they grew up, etc. So I guess that's the way I think about it. I want as much crazy as possible.
And are there any sort of common challenges that your portfolio companies have faced this year?
I could start that one. Since I'm in San Francisco, the most common thing for my companies is it's clearly time to not hire people in San Francisco. Almost everybody has built engineering organizations somewhere outside of Silicon Valley now.
I think there are two challenges portfolio companies have run into. One is if you're in that bucket of incremental change in education, which, as John says, is the majority of stuff out there in this community. When you speak to general tech VCs, they either want to see like a traditional tech business that doesn't touch education with a barge pole, or like education 4.0. But if you're education 2.0, to name an arbitrary number, it's very difficult to get them excited about it. And so I think as a community, and especially us who speak to general tech VCs the whole time, it's a really important mission for us to change the perception of education amongst the general tech VC community who don't really know what they're talking about when it comes to this sector, and for us to help them understand where the opportunities lie. So I did a video on this recently to help companies to give them ammo for their arsenal when they're speaking to VCs about this sort of stuff. The other challenge that we've come across, so we love crazy ideas in all kinds of sectors. One that we really love especially is companies that are helping universities at a strategic level address the massive systemic challenges that they're facing. The demographic they're serving is massively changing, or has already massively changed, and the economics of doing a degree relative to the cost are no longer, it doesn't stack up any longer, and so universities are under a lot of pressure to rethink how they do things and what they do. Companies that are doing that at a sort of strategic level sell into universities at sort of 6-figure or 7-figure ticket prices. And so they're suddenly in the world of tenders and procurement frameworks. And universities are used to buying technology infrastructure where failure is not an option. And so these frameworks are extremely difficult for startups to navigate. What universities should be doing, in my view, is thinking about startup opportunities as sort of things where there's unlimited upside and opportunity for them to differentiate themselves from others in the market. And to identify whether there's upside, you need a very different procurement framework to identify whether there's any chance of failure. And so a lot of the startups we've backed in this area come up against this challenge all the time. That's one of the reasons we've worked with JISC, which is a technology infrastructure provider to the higher ed space in the UK. They work with every single university in this market to create a sort of health check for companies. It's a one-day program. You can apply on the JISC website, and we take you through that program to basically put a stamp of approval on your company saying, look, this is not something that's going to fail. Focus on the upside. And we co-designed that with 35 universities, which is roughly a fifth of the market, to help companies overcome that challenge.
I'd say that that challenge is absolutely spot on, but also the problem that you have there is that the processes that determine who has say and who has power and who can procure what have not changed and are not likely to change for a very long time. And until those do, you're not going to get the sort of the new blood in these institutions that are able to make I would say perhaps more risky decisions vis-a-vis the boards of the universities, but smarter decisions in terms of differentiating themselves in an increasingly competitive and funding challenged market. So I think that definitely sales cycles and getting universities to get that level of comfort is certainly a challenge. And I would say the other thing is on the flip side, looking at more direct-to-consumer businesses, the thing that, and I wouldn't say necessarily that it's a challenge that is just faces our portfolio companies, but faces any any company going direct-to-consumer, is really just to kind of think very carefully about your sort of CAC to LTV sort of ratios, and to think about all of this marketing spend, these customers that you're acquiring, what can you really get out of them, to be very deliberate about calculating that early on, about testing around it, and being very data driven about how your product and your traction is going to lead to a successful scalable business. And that's something that we always challenge our companies to evaluate, because too often in the education space specifically, you have people with very grand ideas and they build amazing products, honestly, truly very, very beautiful products, very good products, user-friendly experiences, but they're not necessarily thinking as much about the business side, about the monetization side, because there is so much mission behind it and so much passion behind it. But that has to be a part of it. It has to be an integral part of it. So I'd say that's something I would focus on.
I mean, I think these are probably all general. They're not quite specific to the last year, but a lot of our companies that do online customer acquisition, the cost of online customer acquisition is so high, and it's really difficult to do well. And the only people who win are Facebook or Google. Here's a bloodbath. One of our portfolio companies from the people in India, it got so expensive for them to get click-throughs to kind of sign up for the service that they found it was cheaper to do downloads of an app. So they would kind of pay to be able to download their app, which had premium content, and that was actually cheaper than getting a proper click-through and sign up on their website. Just to show you how kind of distorted that local market is. And you can spend so much money, but then you also kind of need to show people traction that you can really get yourself in this kind of Sisyphusian bind. The second is if you're in the K-12 school sale model. I've seen a lot of great companies with products I just love. I would buy the products and give them to my friends' kids and stuff. It is really difficult to sell to schools, especially if it's innovative. And it's a lot of times the easiest schools to get into are also the hardest to retain, because they're by nature innovative, but they also have high standards and more flexible. So if they don't like it, they're going to find something better immediately. So kind of your easiest customers to acquire are also the easiest ones to lose. And also a lot of times schools, unfortunately, they kind of want like larger integrated solutions. So if you're saying like, hey, I'm going to sell you the best science kit or something like that, that's amazing, but that's like a very difficult sale to make to a K-12 school because like, you know, it's not the science teacher. We have better traction in K-12. They're either selling a bundle of curricular solutions or they're selling some type of product solution that actually is helping with like a compliance or a legal matter. You know, I think like Clever in the United States is pretty popular, but it's basically helping like back office, like data management compliance. So it's pretty boring, but they do pretty well sell. So that's something the school has to fix, so they're going to get sued. And I think saying more generally, but so much schools is just really thinking thoughtfully through customer retention. Again, you know, I think that a lot of education models that we invest in, we think about, like we see this as like a multi-year relationship with the learner. You know, the company's making a promise to the learner inherently, like, hey, if you come with me, I'm going to produce results. So there is this kind of ethical level to it, but also from a business standpoint, if you really understand your customer retention platform, the customer lifetime value is so much larger that you can actually spend more on your customer acquisition, because like, no, this isn't a one-time sale. Like this is a business partner. This is a relationship we're gonna have for 5 years. But in order to be able to take that risk and find the right customer, like you really have to get your data right on customer retention. And that gets really messy as well. And so I think that something we've been pushing our companies with in terms of like their efficacy reporting is a lot on making sure they're collecting good data on customer retention and loss, so that they can actually relate that back both to their product design, but then also to their customer acquisition. If you can kind of get those three working in a triangle, it can be a really powerful, very powerful tool for the company.
Yeah, and I mean, sorry if I can just add one thing to that, which is that gaming companies gather, I mean, I come from a gaming background, gaming companies gather so much data around sort of retention, and they really track these sort of ratios very actively, and they're very aggressive about them. And for some reason, there are companies in the education space who are producing very similar products who think that they can dispense with the sort of rules of thumb that the gaming industry has to offer. That's a developed, mature industry. There's plenty of data out there about what you should be tracking, about what sorts of results you should be looking for. But as you rightly say, the sort of lifetime value, if you get it right, is so much higher, because people churn from games like this, whereas from educational experiences they stay for a long time. So if you can get both of those things, it's great.
Just a quick one on that. If you're building a classroom or like a learning product, it doesn't actually have to be a classroom product. Just any product focusing on getting the end user to learn something. There's a brilliant resource by a company or a non-profit called Digital Promise in the US, who, amongst other things, have mapped out all the research on different pedagogical or instructional strategies, and which of these strategies work for what kind of learner with which kind of deficiencies, for instance, or motivational factors. And so I think a lot of what you've said comes down to the quality of product, and like people sticking around has to do with whether the product is actually able to engage them and get them to a learning result. And a lot of people seem to be just reinventing the wheel and creating these sort of experiences. Digital Promise is free. Go there. You should definitely be reading their resources on instructional strategies and how to embed them in, how to create design principles for your product that embed those strategies.
Before we move to questions from the audience, it'd be good to get an idea from you guys on some of the trends that you're seeing in EdTech at the moment, and kind of forward-looking how you see the EdTech space changing in the next 2 to 5 years.
I guess I came late, but I gathered the other panel talked a lot about there not really being an EdTech space. I guess in answer to that question, I think that's probably an apt starter. I think for us, it comes down to, if you look at sort of the trajectory of diversity in the workplace, the availability of economic opportunity outside major hubs, if you look at just the return on education in a pure economic sense, all of those have either remained roughly stagnant or worsened over the last 50 years. And I think we're going to get to a point where we hit a wall unless we redesign the system. So, I think there's
there's disruptive stuff happening in the higher ed space. John's finding a lot of disruptive stuff in the K-12 space. And we were really excited about companies that are unafraid to tackle these really big issues, and we think that can be enormously successful from a financial perspective as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's always difficult to sort of to highlight specific trends in terms of buckets of investment, and I don't want to do that. But what I will say is that corporations increasingly leveraging learning as a key retention strategy for their constituents. Corporations increasingly have to compete more than ever, actually, to just retain people. And so one of the key ways that they've found that they can retain their employees is actually to provide them with opportunities to grow and develop within the workplace. And that leads to a whole host of products and services that are extremely interesting and for which there are willing buyers really at very large scales. We've seen this in France with the corporates really investing in their learning and development departments. So for us, that's a really exciting space, one that we're excited to invest in hopefully soon.
For us, I mean, I think that one important, I guess, note of clarification is that Pearson's doing these investments, and we do have similar to kind of market rate returns that Charlie have to hit. But the real reason that companies do Pearson's trying to do is they're trying to kind of keep near to the market, see what's happening, see what might be really big new developments, or might be disruptive, and that's kind of ultimately the justification. So these six that I'm going to kind of throw out there aren't so much about what necessarily are the most attractive markets, but they're ones that we think are kind of relevant enough almost strategically that we're kind of at least thinking about. So one is kind of broadly defined, kind of, I guess, on like boot camps 2.0 and ancillary services. So kind of there's the in-person boot camps that kind of played out, and now there's kind of a second generation of, mixed online, offline, various models. And then I think equally as interesting is kind of services related to boot camps or coding education. Is one, so it's not actually the education, but what kind of services will that kind of education company need. The second would be online synchronous classrooms. So you had this MOOCs, which was offline, they played around. It was never live, but it was synchronous, asynchronous, and then you kind of tried. There were a lot of plays with synchronous tutoring, one-to-one tutoring, but kind of plays where it's the technology's trying to get there, where you could actually have a live group educational experience. And you think what's really interesting is that's quite popular in like gaming, like Twitch and stuff. That there seems to be, no matter how good the content and how good the message for it, there's this kind of human desire to have some type of live experience with people. A third is kind of digital content platforms. That's super big, but it's mainly about kind of, obviously Pearson has a big textbook publishing background, but kind of like what will content platforms related to academic content look like? They're obviously digital, what kind of models? Next generation assessment, so kind of, how do high stakes assessments evolve? They're probably going to become more sophisticated. Hopefully, they'll become more simulation-based. They'll be able to take in lots more skills. So that's another space that could be really important. And then finally, kind of skill identification and matching. So kind of look at someone and figure out what skills they have, what skills they need, how does it map up to existing skills. So those are kind of 6 areas that we think that, at least at a strategic level, are pretty interesting to look at.
We'll just talk about 2 kind of specific areas and specific companies in them. One is kind of the general vocational future work space. And as I mentioned, I've got an investment in Lambda and computer science. Holbert, I know, is here. I'm actually super interested in what's called middle skills. So those things that don't require a college degree, but there's huge demand from employers. A couple good examples of that are IT, and then healthcare services, kind of the non-nurse doctor side, but like healthcare is hiring tons and tons of people doing payment processing, et cetera, et cetera. It's hard to walk into those jobs right out of high school, but with kind of a light amount of training, you can be ready for that. There's a company that I work with called Foundry College, which is pure online junior college, so you get an AA degree out of it, and then you have kind of a major in one of those areas, and they help to place you with employers. I think that's a super interesting space. The other place I spend a lot of time is in the homeschool space, and the company that I'll talk about is called Prenda Learning. So one of the problems with homeschool is a lot of people are like, well, I work, so how am I going to do that? So what's happened in homeschool is it's become, there were these co-ops where people would send their kids to kind of socialize and be around other kids, and that kind of got more and more formalized. So what Prenda did was they basically took the daycare model of, you've got a mom or a dad that's got 2 or 3 kids at home that they're homeschooling. They got 2 or 3 other families, and they work with them all in their homes. So they basically got this set of kids they're working with, and then Prenda has an online platform that does project-based learning and all the academic side. So if you think about that, that person at home does not have to be a teacher. They're more of a guide. They're kind of what we would call in the formal world a paraprofessional. And so the cost of kind of the care side goes down. And since the academics are then in the cloud, you have a lot more ways of making that efficient than if I, the teacher, am kind of sitting with the student all day long. So I think both the vocational and the homeschool area are areas where really a lot of interesting stuff is happening right now.
I think I'll just open it up to the floor if there are any questions.
Thank you, that's very insightful. The word efficacy was mentioned. I wanted to ask you around a question around that. To what extent does efficacy drive your investment decision, knowing that early stage startups have a hard time proving that?
For Pearson, so I think there's two points to that. One is,
Is it possible to repeat the question?
sorry, it was related to efficacy and that to what extent that plays into investment decisions. One, and secondly, kind of the acknowledgement that this can be very difficult for early stage startups to prove or provide evidence of, which I think is spot on. So I think at least us personally, we expect that as a company becomes more mature, we would expect increasingly rigorous levels of evidence. So a startup, kind of just getting their product stable and has customers, there's no way they're going to be able to present proof or anything like it from an academic standpoint. So what we look at a lot more is kind of commitment, stated commitment, willingness to track data, or some type of reference point in literature. So like if they come and say, hey, I have this amazing learning solution, we're going to say, well, okay, but did you check the database? Like, have you read on it? There's probably someone's thought about it. So are you relaying this thing, or are you just kind of making this up on your whiteboard? And second, say, hey, that's fine. Like, are you willing to at least report data or commit to tracking data and at least commit to evaluating yourself? We don't ask them to commit to producing results because you don't know products change a lot, and that's like a pretty big ask. I think the second thing, at least for us, it's a little tricky is for a company that is purporting to provide learnings, absolutely. And sometimes I'll look, maybe it's outcomes to the students, if it's more job focused, or if it's kind of more learning focused, learning gains. However, there are also a lot of companies in the education space that think about they're not actually directly contributing to learning, they're kind of a connected service. And so I think that, to be honest, that's something that we're still puzzling over. If it's actually some type of records management system for something very important like child safety compliance. I think we'd all agree that we want schools or educational institutions to have really strong child safety provisions, but that's not really about learning. So I think that in that case, we're not quite sure what efficacy looks like.
I think for us, and that covers honestly 90% of it. But for us, there's a couple of things. First of all, it's around how you market your business. So it becomes more important, as you said, if you're marketing your business around actually achieving certain outcomes, you do need to have it really early because you're going to be challenged on it by any investor immediately, and they can ask you for the evidence early on. If that's not the main means that you're marketing yourself, then you can kick it down the road as long as you have the willingness to track that data. There are other ways of also measuring efficacy, though. For instance, so if you have a marketplace, you can measure efficacy by the number of times that the client comes back to you for the same service, essentially, right? So, that's something you can prove early on with a pilot, pretty easily. So it really depends on the business. It's very, I know that's sort of a wishy-washy answer, but it depends on how the business markets itself, what it's purporting to do, and that has some relevance for the stage at which you need to offer that evidence. And then secondly, it also it depends on really the product and service. There are ways you can get evidence of efficacy pretty quickly, right? I need a supply teacher. Did I get one within a relatively short space of time? That is demonstrating efficacy.
Maybe just a quick one. So, a lot of the stuff that we fund, all of us, is stuff that's never been done before. So there's not a lot of evidence around what we're doing, and so in some cases it's completely ludicrous to look for a proof of efficacy. In fact, if there were efficacy around it, then the model wouldn't be innovative. And so I think the best you can do often at seed stage is to just show that you have like an affinity with existing pedagogical research if you can do anything. And what we are more interested in is a really strong, what's called in the non-profit world, a theory of change, right? Like why is what we're doing, likely to lead to positive outcomes for and sorry, by the way, there's a really useful framework for this sort of stuff published by Nesta, who's one of our investors. It's a 5-level sort of categorization of impact, which gives you useful language around this stuff.
So we have heard a lot of a tendency to invest in the US and Asia, but I'm wondering what obstacles you found, or if there's any interest in investing in Latin American companies. Well, if there is no interest, what would increase the scope of the sort of company hunting in that area?
I would love to.
Yeah, I mean, we have actually, we have to a degree. What we find is, so we invested in a company that is incorporated in Delaware, but whose headquarters are in Madrid. And what we found is, and they have a big presence in Europe. Now, we have a European investment mandate. We can invest part of the funds in North America. But many successful Spanish startups will look at Latin America as the big market to attack, and it is an attractive market. So we've ended up investing in a company that has, it's called Ironhack. It's a 2.0 boot camp, the second largest in Europe, and they have 5 going on 6 locations in Latin America. So it's a big part of I think how the sort of Iberian Peninsula startups view their growth potential. So yeah, we would be silly to ignore it, I think.
I think so much of venture capital is local. If we have heard on the previous panel, like the majority of VCs just are not producing great results. And so, you really need to be, if you were in my shoes, or in any of our shoes, you would need to concentrate really where you have a core advantage. And because of this feature of VC being so local, like a hot deal that you can identify before someone else does, because you know someone in the community in which you operate. It's just I guess exponentially more difficult the further away a startup is geographically located to get into a advantageous position. So definitely on a sort of opportunistic level, and we have as well in the past, but it's not core for us.
Yeah, that's not priority, but at my previous job, I worked with Latin American startups education. I guess my one thought on that is that there's a lot of attractiveness there, but not in the K-12 or the college space because the market's massive. You have a lot kind of like some cultural things, obviously the language, a lot of things, but as soon as you start going to K-12 or higher ed, the regulatory frameworks from one country to another are completely different. So, in Brazil, you can do a for-profit higher ed, and that's like illegal in Colombia. And those are 2 kind of initially attractive markets. And so I think that sometimes if you're not thinking more broadly about education, the kind of pan-LATAM thesis starts to break down a little bit upon closer investigation.
Hi, my question is similar to his, but now more related to Africa. And I would like to focus more on the institutional constraints that maybe prevent you from investing in emerging markets like Africa. I know we've got political issues, currency, credit ratings are really bad in South Africa at the moment. So can you just maybe unpack those and maybe also dispel the myth that... Sorry, and maybe dispel the myth that... Okay. So most people think that you do need to have a business set up in the US or in the UK. These are most entrepreneurs in Africa, where I'm from. So it kind of limits as well looking for funding outside. So do you, like, and your LPs find that necessary?
So some of us have strictures, right? And as I just explained about Latin America, we can't invest directly in Latin American startups, but through investing in Spanish startups, we end up sort of there. Honestly, our mandate doesn't allow us to, but I think that what we do see a lot of opportunity there, and I think for the companies that I've spoken to that are basing their operations or a significant portion of their operations out of South Africa, or Ghana, for instance, they're taking advantage of the sort of arbitrage in labor costs, between Western consumers and the lower cost of labor in those regions, and I think that gives an enormous advantage to South African companies. So I think it makes them very attractive. The question is, how do you get to that point where you have enough funds to establish operations to a degree in the UK or wherever else in Europe? I think that really the South African, hopefully, I don't know if there are any of them here today, but I know there are some South African funds that help startups do that. I'm not aware outside of South Africa just because of lack of knowledge, but I would say that local investors really should be helping startups to bridge that gap with it.
We do invest. I mean, previously, kind of Pop Pearson in Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa, we made investments. I think that most people we talk to would say that there's no doubt about the talent of the entrepreneurs or kind of like the long-term demographic. These when I talk to in several countries, people are crazy, about multiple countries, kind of the talent there and like what's going to happen writ large. I think one advantage Pearson has is that we have operating business entities in a gazillion countries, and also, although we don't like to, we can kind of manage currency risk a little bit differently, and we have lawyers. So ultimately, they're not actually going to get involved, but someone's probably not going to try to pull pull one over completely on a company like Pearson, because ultimately they could hire a lawyer and fight it out in court. Whereas I think if you start talking about independent VC, swallowing the currency risk is huge for them because they're always going to be back in their home currency. Secondly, they just don't understand or necessarily have the appetite for the local legal frameworks. They just don't know what to do. They don't know who they can really trust. So that's just another huge hurdle. Hey, who's a good lawyer who can instruct me about if this person's just making something up or not? And then I think the third is this a question of exit. So I think that if you need to get your money back in 5 years, how are you going to do that? Who's going to buy that company that you put your money into? So to me, at least at a high level, those are kind of like some of the other people or more traditional VCs that I talk to. Those are some of their concerns. But so we invest there because we can kind of manage that. But that's kind of because of our affiliation with corporate.
The only thing I would add is that I think that almost all venture capitalists are cheap. They basically just follow whatever just worked. And Africa's got companies like Andela now that are just going to be huge exits when they happen. And I think what you'll see is especially venture capitalists outside of the education area say, gosh, we didn't know that would work. Maybe we should do more. So it's very incremental, but they'll kind of start to tilt more and more as you see better exits in Africa.
We're running out of time, so we can just perhaps take one more question.
What do you think is the most exciting things that are happening in a sort of more lifelong learning, post sort of university, post school education? What do you see as the most exciting areas in those spaces?
I think the first thing I'd say is that depending on what study you look at, between 20 and 50% of jobs are sort of estimated to be at risk from automation in the next 20 to 50 years. And so, I think everyone in this room would agree that the paradigm is going to shift from investing in your education as a one-off thing at the start of life and then going through a static career towards continuously re-educating oneself. And so we're really excited about that because it means the entire infrastructure of how we educate people needs to change. Already, the majority of students at universities in the US comes from a non-traditional background. They're working people, they're single parents, they're distance learners, and yet universities spend a ton of money on physical buildings and traditional processes. So I think the opportunity is massive, and we'll see a lot in the space. One really exciting company we've backed is the London Interdisciplinary School, which offers a problem-based education both to undergrads and for people in work. And so, we're really excited about this because they're taking a different view of the types of skills that are needed in the workplace and in the world. And they're basically saying, if you want to solve the biggest problems, they don't neatly fit into subject categories. You can't solve malaria, say, by studying global health, but you can't solve it by studying sociology. Right? And in fact, you need mental models from the major disciplines in order to tackle any problem of that scale. And so they've designed a curriculum based on this idea of interdisciplinary studies to create a generation of people that are able to do it. We're super excited about what's coming in that space.
I think from our perspective, something that we found very interesting, there's many things interesting about lifelong learning, but it's the fact that it's often a lot cheaper for a corporate in Europe to retrain someone or to find someone that is open to learning a new skill within the corporation than to hire someone new and to let go of the previous person. So in Europe, there's lots of initiatives within companies looking at how can we use the human capital that we already have in a more efficient manner. So that's not only for for the sort of training and learning side, but also is someone in the wrong department, with their skills better be utilized in the department. I think that actually making better use of the assets you have within your corporation is like a huge part of it, and training and learning is a huge part of doing that. So that's something we like to look at.
Last year, Pearson did a piece of research I thought was pretty good. It was called The Future of Skills 2030. It was basically this question. They did some fancy methods and broke down specific skills and what's most likely to disappear. And I think that a big shift in thinking about jobs is buckets of skills. It's like one of my favorite analogies from this research that I usually talk about is a librarian. So if you naively define a librarian as someone who's in charge of organizing books, there's no reason a librarian should exist. When I was at graduate school a couple years ago, they did a renovation, they turned the entire library digital while I was there. But of course, if you think about librarians as people whose job is to organize and help you access relevant knowledge, that is like more relevant now than ever. And so a lot of those core skills will be the research skills, like understanding will still be there. Maybe you get rid of the old, I don't know, I'm showing my age, but those old like kind of card letter boxes, and now you're doing database search. But actually, you don't need a full retraining. You just need, some sets of skills. And I think in order to be able to, so a lot of jobs that we talk about disappearing, they're not going to disappear. It's just that like 30% of the skills that currently make up that bucket will be swapped out. And I think so in order to solve that problem, you kind of need three things. The first is actually the ways to develop those micro skills, which I think actually there's a lot of movement in already in a lot of cases. The second one is to be able to identify and even define. Actually, if you get down to it, a lot of times, like corporations think they know what skills they need, but if you actually press them, like give me a list of like well-defined learning objectives, good luck. And the flip side is people don't know how to kind of talk about their own skill set that way. So second is kind of skill identification matching. And then I think the third, there really will be this important aspect about kind of finding new ways to assess. In the sense that, you can't just give someone a multiple choice test if you're talking about work. So kind of much more immersive simulation-based assessment methods. So you can say, hey, identify my skills, I took this course, but who's going to kind of stamp approval that, hey, this person can actually now do the job?
So I think while we're setting up the food, we're going to have one more question come back here, but first I want to say something that I was supposed to say at the beginning and forgot to, which is for the startups and emerging companies that are here today. You guys have a great free resource called Cooligo. It's www.cooligo.com, and I'll put the slide up at the end. But great free resource for emerging companies looking at just all the legal basics that they need to know, some basic forms and templates. So please check it out. So with that, one last question.
Hello. I would love to get your thoughts as investors on the role of diversity, so particularly women and people of color. As
It's part of this problem, I think, in a lot of ways. But there's a group now called All Raise in Silicon Valley for female founders and female venture capitalists. It's basically a network where people have office hours, etc., and it's resulted in some very good financing rounds. So even as a female founder in Europe, if you are thinking about raising venture, I would suggest checking out that organization, possibly kind of showing up, because you can definitely, the number of female venture capitalists, sadly, is extremely low as well, but many of them are in this organization, and it's a big movement. So that would be one resource I would suggest.
I think that we're somewhat fortunate in the sense that, at least our legacy portfolio companies had 3 female founders, and, there are no white male founders, but that's also kind of a product of where we've been investing historically, which is kind of, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And so I think that we're going to be extra vigilant on that as we start making more investments in the UK and the US, kind of maybe where these kind of issues are most at the forefront. I think that there's also lots of really interesting layers. So, actually maybe the signals that would be red flags in one country would be sufficient there, but then maybe another country you actually have to go a level down because the dynamics or the inequity in that country would look very different. And I guess my last thought is I think that at least as a starting step, it's very difficult to get people to make binding commitments. That's great, but the first step a lot of times is just get people to commit to report. I think a lot, there's just kind of that transparency, no one wants to oh yeah, all my companies are only bros. No one wants that, and so as a first step, you get people on the record with that. I think that's a really practical, actionable first step.
Thank you very much. So as Matt said, there are lots of resources